Chapter 14. The Mystery of Mind. The writer in this book has treated the two manifestations of life, viz., mind and substance, as if they were separate things, although he has hinted at his belief that substance, at the last, might be found to emanate from mind and be but a cruder form of its expression. The better way to express the thought would be to say that he believes that both substance and mind as we know it are but expressions of a form of mind as much higher than that which we know as mind, as the latter is higher than substance. But he does not intend to follow up this belief in this book, as the field of the work lies along other lines. The idea is mentioned here merely for the purpose of giving a clue to those who might be interested in the conclusions of the writer regarding this more remote regions of the general subject. The writer agrees with the ancient occult teachings regarding the existence of the cosmic mind, as he has stated in the last chapter. This cosmic mind, he believes, is independent of substance. In fact, it is the mother of substance and its twin brother, mind as we know it. Mind as we know it and substance are always found in connection with other. It is true that the form of substance used by mind as its body may be far finer than the rarest vapor that we know, but it is substance nevertheless. The working of the great plan of the universe seems to require that mind shall always have a body with which to work, and this rule applies not only in the case of the densest form of substance, and the mind principle manifesting through it, but also in the case of the highest manifestation of mind as we know it, which requires a body through which to manifest. This constant combination of mind and substance, the fact that no substance has been found without at least a trace of mind, and no mind except in relation to and combination with substance, has led many scientific thinkers to accept the materialistic idea that mind was but a property of substance, or a quality thereof. Of course, these philosophers and thinkers have had to admit that they could form no idea of the real nature of mind, and could not conceive how substance really could think. But they found the materialistic idea a simpler one than its opposite, and so they fell into it. Notwithstanding the fact that there was always a something within that would cry "Pshaw!" at the conclusion of the argument or illustration, these men have thought it reasonable to believe that there was no such thing as mind except as a result of irritation of tissue, etc. But nevertheless, there was always a something in us that in spite of argument keeps crying like a child, "'Tain't so!" And wonderful to relate, we heed the little voice. This materialistic theory is a curious reversal of the facts of the case. Even the very conclusions and reasoning of these thinkers is made possible only by the existence of that mind which they would deny. The human reason is incapable of explaining the inner operation of the mind upon a strictly and purely physical basis. Tyndall, the great English scientist, truthfully said, "The passage from the physics of the brain to the corresponding facts of consciousness is unthinkable. Granted that a definite thought and a definite molecular action of the brain occur simultaneously, we do not possess the intellectual organ, nor apparently any rudiment of the organ, which would enable us to pass by a process of reasoning from the one phenomenon to the other." The materialist is prone to an attempt to rout the advocates of mind with a demand for an answer to the question, "What is mind?" The best answer to that question lies along the proverbial Irishman's lines of answering a question by asking another one, resulting in the answering question, "What is matter?" As a fact, the human reason is unable to give an intelligent answer to either question, and the best opinion seems to be to consider them as but two aspects of something, the real origin of which lies in something higher, of which both are aspects or forms of expression. The occult teaching with which the writer agrees is that the mind inherent in any portion of substance, from the corpuscle up to the brain of man, is but a segregated, or apparently separated, portion of the universal mind principle, or cosmic mind. This fragment of mind is always connected with substance, and in fact it is believed that it is separated from the universal mind and the other separate minds by a film of the rarest substance, so fine as to be scarcely distinguishable from mind. This separation is not a total separation, however, for the fragment of mind is in connection with all other fragments of mind by mental filaments, and besides is never out of touch with the cosmic mind. But comparatively, the fragment of mind is apart from the rest, and we must consider it in this way, at least for the purpose of study, consideration, and illustration. It is like a drop in the ocean of mind, although connected in a way with every other drop and the ocean itself. The individual mind is not closely confined within the substance in which it abides, but extends beyond the physical limits of the substance, sometimes to quite a considerable distance. The aura, or egg-shaped projection or emanation of mind surrounding each particle in each individual, is an instance of this. In addition to the aura, there is possibly an extension of mind to a considerable distance beyond the immediate vicinity of the physical limits, the connection, however, never being broken during the life-term. Mental influence at a distance, however, does not always require the above-mentioned projection of the mind. Thought waves often answer the purpose, and besides, there is such a thing as the imparting of mental vibrations to the small particles of substances with which the atmosphere is filled, which vibrations continue for quite a time, often for a long period after the presence of the individual producing them. These matters shall be discussed in later chapters of this book. The mind of man is a far more complex thing than is generally imagined by the average man, not only in its varied manifestation of consciousness, but its great region of below consciousness, or infra-consciousness, as it is called. It shall be the purpose of the sequel to this book, now in preparation, which will be entitled The Wonders of the Mind, to describe these inner workings and to point out methods of utilizing the same. Our next chapter, entitled The Finer Forces of the Mind, will lead us into this field. End of Chapter 14.
Chapter 15. The Finer Forces of the Mind. It was the writer's original intention to close the book with a chapter in which he brought to a close his argument and presentation of the case of dynamic thought. The book was written for the purpose of demonstrating that theory, and it naturally should have closed there. The writer has in simultaneous course of preparation a companion book entitled The Wonders of the Mind, in which, in addition to information and instruction regarding the latent powers and hidden regions of the mind, including an investigation of the infraconscious and ultraconscious regions, automatic thinking, occult systems of mentation, mental development and unfoldment, etc., he purposes taking up the subject of dynamic thought from the mental plane of man, that he thought it better to keep the two branches of the subject separate and apart. But notwithstanding the above facts, he feels that he cannot close the present book. The consideration of the present phase of the subject, without at least a passing reference to the fact that dynamic thought is fully operative on the plane of human mentation, as on the plane of atomic mentation. In fact, man has the same power, potentially, that is possessed by the atom, only refined to a degree corresponding to the development of man as compared to that of the atom. The power is raised to a higher plane of mentation, but is fully operative. Just as the body of man contains physical life corresponding with the different phases of lower physical life, mineral, vegetable, and animal, for instance, the mineral-like bones and the mineral salts in the system, the plant-like life and work of the cells, and the animal-like flesh and physical life, in addition to the wonderful brain structure and fine brain development peculiar to man. So has man the lower mental qualities of the lower life, in addition to his glorious human consciousness that is reserved to the highest form of life on the globe. In his mental regions, man has the power of the atom of attracting articles of substance to him, that he may combine it with other substances in building up his body. Then he has the plant-like cell mentation, that does the building up work and repairs wounds and damaged parts, etc. Then he has the animal mentation, evidencing in the passions, desires, and emotions of the purely animal nature, and which mentation, by the way, keeps man busy in controlling by means of his higher mental faculties, that are God's gift to man, and are not possessed by the animals. But all this will form part of the sequel, the wonders of the mind, and are merely mentioned here in passing. And just as man is enabled to use elementary, the physical qualities that he finds in his body, and to turn same to good account in living his human life, so does man, consciously or unconsciously, make use of these elementary mental powers in his everyday mental life. And if he but realizes what a conscious use of these faculties, guided by the human will do, many may become a different order of being. This is the basis of the occult teachings and the mysteries of the ancients, as well as the teachings of the modern secret esoteric bodies and societies such as the Rosicrucians and Hermetic Brotherhood, and several other societies whose names are not known. The real societies are referred to, not the brazen imitations that unscrupulous men are holding out to the public as the original orders, membership being offered and urged for the consideration of a few dollars. It is needless to say that membership in the real occult orders is never urged and cannot be bought. But to return to the subject, the individual mind of man is in direct touch, not only with the great cosmic mind, but also with the individual mind of every other man. Just as the particles are bound by lines of attraction, so are the minds of men bound together by lines of mind, or mental filaments. And just as special forms of attraction exist between the particles, so do special forms of attraction exist between men. And just as particles are influenced at the distance by other particles, so are men influenced at the distance by other men. And just as the particle draws toward itself that which it desires, so do men draw toward themselves that which they desire. And just as mental states and excitement are transmitted or communicated from particle to particle, so are mental states or excitement transmitted or communicated from men to men. As above, so below; as below, so above, says the old occult maxim, and it may be found to operate on every plane. The phenomena of thought, transference, telepathy, telesthesia, mental projection, suggestion, hypnotism, mesmerism, etc., etc., may be explained and understood by reason of an acquaintance with the theory of dynamic thought, as explained in this book. An understanding of one gives you the key to the other, for the law operates precisely the same on each particular plane. If the reader will think over this statement and then apply it to his investigations and experiments, he will find that he has the key to many mysteries, the loose end of a mighty ball of thread which he may unwind at his leisure. Let us begin by a consideration of the process of thought production in the human mind. In this way we may arrive at a clearer idea of the mental phenomena known as thought force, mental power, thought waves, thought vibrations, mind transference, mental influence, etc. To understand these things we must begin by understanding the process of thought production. Here is found the secret of the phenomena named, and much more. In the first place, while the brain is the organ of the mind, the instrument that the mind uses in producing thought, still the brain does not do the thinking, nor is the brain matter visible to the eye, the material instrument of thinking. The brain and other portions of the nervous systems, including the little brains or ganglia found in various parts of the body, is composed of a certain substance, a fine form of plasm, which, however, is but the groundwork or foundation for finer forms of substance used in the production of thought. Science has not discovered this finer substance, for it is not visible to the eye, or to the finest instruments, but trained oculists know that it exists. This finer substance escapes the scalpel and microscope of the biologists and anatomists, and consequently their search for mind in the brain is futile. There is something more than tissue to be irritated in the brain, but remember that this something more is still substance, and not mind itself. Thought is a form of excitement in this fine brain substance, which we may as well call psychoplasm, from the two Greek words meaning the mind and a mould or matrix, respectively. The combined word meaning the mould or matrix of mind, in other words, the material substance used by the mind in which to cast or mould thoughts. This excitement in the psychoplasm manifests in vibrations of its particles, for, like all substances, it has particles. All scientists agree that in the process of thinking there is an expenditure of energy and a using up of material substance. Just how this is effected they do not know, but their experiments have known that there is energy manifested and used, and also substance consumed. The secret of the production of thought does not lie in the brain or nervous system, which are but the material substratum upon which the mind works, and which it uses as a mould or matrix for the production of thought. Thought is the product of mind directing force upon substance in the shape of psychoplasm, and energy is manifested in the production of thought just as much as in the operation of the law of attraction or chemical action. What force and energy, may be asked? The answer is mental force. But although the answer stares them right in the face, scientists deny that mind contains force or energy within itself, and persist in thinking of force as a mechanical thing, or as necessarily derived from the common forms of energy, such as heat, light, or electricity. They ignore the fact that mind has a minor force, which it uses to perform its work. How do the atoms attract each other and move together? There is an evidence of force and energy here that is not heat, light, or electricity. What is it? When a man wishes to close his hand, he wills that it be closed, and sends a current from this finer force of the mind along the nerve to the muscle, and the latter contracts and the hand is closed. A similar process is used in every muscular action. What is the force used? What is the force used? Science admits the existence of this force and calls it nervous energy or nerve force. It holds that it must be something like electricity, and some even go so far as to say that it is electricity. They base their ideas upon the fact that when electricity is applied to the muscle of living or dead animals, they contract as they do when this nerve force is applied, and every movement of the muscle may be so produced by electricity, which becomes a counterfeit nerve force. But here is the point. This force cannot be identical with electricity, for none of the appliances for registering electric currents will register it. It is not electricity, but is some finer force of the mind, generated in the material substratum that the mind uses as a base of operation. This fine force of the mind is generated in some way in the brain and nervous system by action upon the psychoplasm. The brain, or brains, for man has several centres worthy of that term, are like great dynamos and storehouses of this force, and the nerves are the wires that carry it to all parts of the system. More than this, the nerves have been found to be generators of force, also as well as the brain. Experiments have shown that the supply of force in a nerve vanishes when the nerve is used. in which case it draws upon the storehouses for an additional supply. This fine force of the mind is really the source of all energy, for as we have shown in previous chapters, all motion arises from mental action, and this form of force or energy is the primal force or energy produced by the mind. And this force is in operation in all forms of life, from the atom to the man, and not only may it be used by the particle, but man also has it at his disposal. As a proof that substance is used up and energy manifested in the production of thought, science points to the fact that the temperature of a nerve rises when it is used, and the temperature of the brain increases when it is used for extended thought. Scientists have claimed, and advanced a mass of proof to back up the same, that thought was as much a form of energy as was the pulling of a train of cars, and was attended by the production of a definite amount of heat, resulting from the activity of the fine substance of the physical extended resistant and composite substratum. But science has taken all this to mean that thought and mind were purely material things and properties of matter. It has claimed that matter thinks, instead of that mind uses the matter or substance in its finer forms as a substratum for the production of thought. Buchner, the leader of the purely materialistic school, claims positively that thought is but the product of matter. He says, "It is not a patent fact, obvious to all but the wilfully blind, that matter does think." De la Mettrie made merry over the narrowness of the mentalists in saying, "When people ask whether matter can think, it is as though they asked whether matter can strike the hours." Matter indeed, as such, thinks as little as it strikes the hours, but it does both when brought into such conditions that thinking or hour striking results as a natural action or performance. The above quoted opinion of Buchner shows how narrow and one-sided a talented man may become by reason of shutting out all the other points of view, and seeing only one phase of a subject. The example of the hour striking is a poor figure of the materialists, for although matter does strike the hours, it does so only when wound up by man under direction of his mind, and in the manufacture, adjustment, and winding of the clock. Mind is the cause of the action, and more than this, the very action of the coiled spring, that is, the immediate cause of the striking, results from the mental effort of the particles of the spring endeavouring to resume their accustomed position under the law of elasticity, as explained in our chapters on substance. Science renders valuable service in showing us the details of the mechanism of thought, but it will never really explain anything unless it assumes the existence of mind back of and in everything. It may dissect the brain cells and show us their composition, but it never will find mind under the scalpel or in the scale or test tube. Not only is this true, but it cannot even discover the fine psychoplasm which is used in the production of mind. But we may make use of its investigations regarding the matter activity of brain substance in the process of thought, and by combining them with our belief regarding the existence of mind, we may form a complete chain of reasoning, without any missing links. These missing links, appearing both in the case of the no-mind philosophers and the no-matter metaphysicians. This theory of mind and substance considered as the two aspects of something higher, from which both have originated or emanated, will come to be regarded as the only thinkable proposition in the end, and with this idea in view we may use the facts and experiments of the materialists while smiling at their theories, and, with but a slight change of words, we may turn against them their own verbal batteries. In this way we may take Molescott's famous statement, "Thought is but a motion of matter," and render it intelligible by making it read as follows: Thought produces motion in matter. This finer force of the mind is in full evidence to those who look for it, and although it may not be registered by the scales or instruments designed to register the coarser grades of force, still it is registered in the minds of men and women, and in the actions resulting from their thoughts. These living registers of the force respond readily to it, and every one of us is such a register. Just as is the force a much higher grade of energy than the forms usually considered as comprising the entire range of energy, so are the instruments required for its registration much higher than those used to determine the degrees of heat, light, electricity, and magnetism. It may be that the future will give us instruments adapted for the purpose. In fact, it begins to look even now as if the same were forthcoming. But whether we have such mechanical instruments or not, the living instruments give us a sufficient proof for the existence of the force and its operation. Well, the writer still finds himself unable to bring the book to a close. He added this chapter to show that the property of dynamic thought extended to the highest development of mind, as well as abiding in the lowest. And now that he has ventured upon the subject, he finds himself impelled to give you a few instances of the workings and operations of that law in the case of human mental life. And this means one more chapter, but only one. Remember, the book must come to an end sometime, remember, and so we will pass over into another chapter, which will be entitled Thought in Action. End of chapter 15.
Chapter 16. Thought in Action. Without attempting to go into details or to enter into explanations, the writer proposes taking his readers on a flying trip through the region of thought in action, or dynamic thought in operation in human life. The details of this fascinating region must be left for another and more extended visit in our next book before mentioned, which will be called The Wonders of the Mind. But he thinks that even this flying trip will prove of interest and instruction. Let us start with a hasty look at man himself. Not to speak of his 7 planes of mind, which belongs to the next visit, we find him a very interesting object. Not only has he a physical body, apparent to our senses, but he has also a finer or astral body, which he may use, unconsciously or consciously when he learns how, for little excursions away from the body during his lifetime. This astral body is composed of substance just as his denser physical body. The field and range of substance extends far beyond the powers of ordinary vision, as even the materialist must admit when they talk of radiant matter, ethereal substance, etc. Then he has currents of fine force coursing through his nervous system, which may be seen by those possessing astral vision, if the teaching of the occultist be true. Then he, like the particle, has an aura, or egg-shaped projection of mind and fine particles of psychoplasm, which has been thrown off in the process of thought, and which clusters around him, producing a mental atmosphere, which constantly surrounds him, and makes itself felt by those coming in his presence. Those who read these words may remember readily the feeling they have experienced when coming in contact with certain people, how some radiated an atmosphere of cheerfulness, brightness, etc., while others radiated the very opposite. Some radiate a feeling of energy, activity, etc., while others manifest just the reverse. Many likes and dislikes between people meeting for the first time arise in this way, each finding in the mental atmosphere of the other some inharmonious element. These radiations are perceived by others coming into their range. Occultists tell us that the character of a man's thought vibrations may be determined by certain colors, which are visible to those having astral sight. There is nothing so wonderful about this, when it is remembered that the various colors of light, comprising the visible colors of the spectrum, ranging from red on through orange, yellow, green, blue, indigo, and terminating in violet, arise simply from different rates of vibration of the particles of substance. And as the thought is produced by mind causing vibrations in the psychoplasm, why is not the astral colors reasonable? We cannot stop to consider these colors in detail, but may run over the ones corresponding to each marked emotion of thought as reported by the occult teachings. For instance, the shade of the thought manifesting in physical or organic functions is of a colorless white, or color of clear water, and the color of the thought manifesting in fine force or vital energy is that of air, heated air arising from a furnace or heated ground. When it emerges from the body, although of a faint pink when in the body itself, black represents hate, malice, etc. Gray, bright shade, represents selfishness, while gray of a dark, dull shade represents fear. Green represents jealousy, deceit, treachery, and similar emotions, ranging from the dull shades which characterize the lower and cruder forms to the bright shades which characterize the finer or more delicate forms of tact, politeness, and diplomacy, etc. Red, dull shade, represents sensuality and animal passion, while red, bright and vivid, represents anger. Crimson in varying shades represents the phases of love. Brown represents avarice or greed. Orange represents pride and ambition, and yellow in varying shades represent grades of intellectual power. Blue is the color of the religious thoughts, ranging, however, through a great variety of stages, from the dull shade of superstitious religious belief to the beautiful violet of the highest religion, emotion, or thought. What is generally known as spirituality is characterized by a light blue of a peculiar luminous shade. Just as there are ultra-red or ultraviolet rays in the spectrum, which the eye cannot perceive, so occultists inform us there are colors in the aura or mental atmosphere of a person of unusual psychic or occult development. The ultraviolet rays indicating the thought of one who is pursuing the higher planes of occult thought and unfoldment, while the ultra-red is evidenced by those possessing occult development, but who are using the same for base and selfish purposes, black magic in fact. There are other shades, known to occultists, indicating several highly developed states of mind, but it is needless to mention them here. But the influence of these particles of thought stuff, thrown off from the mind, psychoplasm, under the vibrations produced by the mind during the process of thought, does not cease with the phenomena surrounding the aura. They are radiated to a considerable distance and produce a number of effects. Particles are thrown off in great quantities, each vibrating at the rate imparted to it during the process. No, these particles of thought stuff do not compose the thought waves. The latter belong to a different set of phenomena. These particles of vibrating thought stuff fly off from the brain of the thinker in all directions and affect other persons who may come in contact with them. There is an important rule here, however, and that is that they seem to be attracted by those minds which are vibrating in similar thought rates with themselves, and are but feebly attracted, and in some cases actually repelled by minds vibrating on opposite lines of thought. Like attracts like in the thought world, and birds of a feather flock together here as elsewhere. Some of these particles of thought stuff are still in existence and vibrating, which proceeded from the minds of persons long since dead, the same being emitted or thrown off during the lifetime of the persons, however, just as a distant star, which was destroyed hundreds of years ago, may have emitted rays which are only now reaching our vision, years after the destruction of the star which emitted them, and just as an odor will remain in a room after the object causing it has departed, the particle still remaining and vibrating. And just as a stove removed from a room may leave heat vibrations behind it, so do these particles persist, vibrate, and influence other minds long after the person who caused them may have passed out of the body. In this way, rooms, houses, neighborhoods, and localities may vibrate with the thoughts of people who lived there long ago, who have since passed away or removed. These vibrations affect people living in these places to a greater or lesser extent, depending upon circumstances, but they may always be counteracted or changed if they are of undesirable nature by setting upon positive vibrations on a different plane of mind or character of thought. The mind of a thinker is constantly emitting or throwing off these particles of thought stuff, the distance and rate of speed to and by which they travel being determined by the force used in their production, there being a great difference between the thought of a vigorous thinker and that emanating from a weak, listless mind. These projections of thought stuff have a tendency to mingle with others of a corresponding rate of vibration, depending upon the character of the thought. Some remain around the places where they were emitted, while others float off like clouds and obey the law of attraction, which draws them to persons thinking along similar lines. The characteristics of cities arise in this way, the general average of thought of their inhabitants causing a corresponding thought atmosphere to hang over and around it, which atmosphere is distinctly felt by visitors, and often determines the mental character of the persons residing there, in spite of their previous characteristics, that is, unless they understand the laws of thought. Some neighborhoods also have their own peculiar mental atmosphere, as all may have noticed if they have visited certain tough neighborhoods, on the one hand, and neighborhoods of an opposite kind on the other. Certain kinds of thoughts and actions seem to be contagious in certain places, and they are those who do not understand the law. Certain shops seem to have their own atmosphere, some reflecting confidence and honest dealing, and others radiating an atmosphere that causes patrons to hold tightly to their pocketbooks, and, in some extreme cases, to be certain that their buttons are tightly sewed on their garments. Yes, places like people have their distinctive mental atmospheres, and both arise from the same cause. And each person draws to himself these particles of vibrating thought stuff, corresponding with the general mental attitude maintained by him. If one harbors feelings of malice, he will find thoughts of malice, revenge, hate, etc., pouring in upon him. He has made himself a center of attraction, and has set the law into operation. His only safe course is to resolutely change his thought vibrations. A most remarkable form of these particles of thought stuff is evidenced in the case of what are known among occultists as thought forms, which are aggregations of particles of thought stuff energized by intense and positive thought, and which are sent out with such intensity and positiveness that they are almost vitalized and manifest almost the same degree of mental influence that would be manifested by the sender if he were present where they are. This highly interesting phase of the subject would take many chapters to describe in detail, and we must content ourselves with a mere passing view. To those who are interested in the subject, the writer would say that he proposes considering them at considerable length in the forthcoming book, The Wonders of the Mind, which has been alluded to elsewhere. Besides the operation of these particles of thought stuff emitted during the production of thought, there are many other phases of thought influence, or thought in action. The principal phase of this phenomena arises from the working of the law of attraction between the respective minds of different people. Just as there are particles of substance united and connected by lines of connection, so are the minds of men connected, and the strong pull of desire manifest along these lines, just as it does in the case of the atoms. There has been much written of recent years regarding this drawing power of the mind, and although some of what has been written is the veriest rubbish and nonsense, yet under it all there remains a strong, substantial substratum of fact and truth. Men do attract success and failure to them. People do attract things to them, as strange as it may seem to the person who has not acquainted himself with the laws of underlying the phenomenon. There is no miracle about all of this. It is simply that the law of attraction is in full operation, and that people of similar thoughts are drawn together by reason thereof. The workings of this law are somewhat intricate, but all of us are constantly using them, consciously or unconsciously. We draw to ourselves that which we desire very much, or that which we fear very much, for a fear is a belief and acts in the direction of actualizing itself, sometimes. But again, as Kipling would say, but that's another story. This phase of the subject is a mighty subject in itself, and the half has not been told, even by the many who have written of it. The writer intends to try to remedy the deficiency in his next book, however. Then again, the excitement of thought in the minds of people may be transmitted or communicated to the minds of others, and a similar vibration set up. Under certain conditions and subject to certain restraining influences, just as in the case of the particles of substances in a body or mass of substance, and in many ways that will suggest themselves to the reader who has mastered the contents of the earlier chapters of this book. The phenomena of dynamic thought in the case of the atoms and particles may be and are duplicated in the case of individual minds of men. The reader will see readily that this theory of dynamic thought and the facts noted in the consideration thereof give an intelligent explanation for the respective phenomena of hypnotism, mesmerism, suggestion, thought transference, telepathy, etc., as well as of mental healing, magnetic healing, etc., all of which are manifestations of dynamic thought. Not only do we see, as Prentice Mulford said, that thoughts are things, but we may see just why they are things. And we may see and understand the laws of their production and operation. This theory of dynamic thought will throw light into many dark corners and make plain many hard sayings that have perplexed you in the past. The writer believes that it gives us the key to many of the great riddles of life. This theory has come to stay. It is no ephemeral thing, doomed to die a borning. It will be taken up by others and polished, and added to, and shaped and decorated. But the fundamental principles will stand the stress of time and men. Of this the writer feels assured. It may be laughed at first, not only by the man on the street, but also by the scientist. But it will outlive this, and in time will come to its own, perhaps long after the writer and the book have been forgotten. This must be so, for the idea of dynamic thought underlies the entire universe, and is the cause of all phenomena. Not only is all that we see as life and mind and substance illustrations of the law, but even that which lies back of these things must evidence the same law. Is it too daring a conception to hazard the thought that perhaps the universe itself is the result of the dynamic thought of the infinite? O dynamic thought, we see in thee the instrument by which all form and shape are created, changed and destroyed. We see in thee the source of all energy, force, and motion. We see thee always, present and everywhere, present and always in action. Verily thou art life and action. Thou art the embodiment of action and motion, of which Zittel hath said, wherever our eyes dwell on the universe, whithersoever we are carried in the flight of thought, everywhere we find motion. Suns, planets, worlds, bodies, atoms, and particles move and act at thy bidding. Amidst all the change of substance, among the play of forces, and among and amidst all the results therefrom, there art thou, unchanged and constant. As though fresh from the hand of the infinite, thou hast maintained thy vigor and strength and power throughout the aeons of time. And likewise space has no terrors for thee, for thou hast mastered it. Thou art a symbol of the power of the infinite. Thou art its message to doubting man. Let us close this book with a thought of the greatness of this thing that we call dynamic thought, which, great as it is but as the shadow of the absolute power of the infinite one, which is the causeless cause and the causer of causes. And in thus parting company, reader, let us murmur the words of the German poet who has sung, Dost thou ask for rest? See then how foolish is thy desire. The stern yoke of motion holds in harness the whole universe. Nowhere in this age canst thou ever find rest, and no power can deliver thee from the doom of activity. Rest is not to be found either in heaven or on earth, and from death and dying break forth new growth, new birth. All the life of nature is an ocean of activity. Following on her footsteps, without ceasing, thou must march forward with the whole. Even the dark portal of death gives thee no rest, and out of thy coffin will spring blossoms of a new life. Finis. End of chapter 16. End of Dynamic Thought, or the Law of Vibrant Energy by William Walker Atkinson.